Nancy Allen was 25 years old, nearly out of money, and dangerously close to giving up. Los Angeles had not welcomed her the way she had imagined. The city that was supposed to open doors had done the opposite. Auditions were thin. Calls did not come. The hopeful rhythm she had carried across the country was beginning to collapse into something far more familiar in Hollywood: silence. She had already heard the kind of words that stay in a person's head for years. One agent had looked at her, and with the cold certainty this business so often mistakes for wisdom, told her she was already too old to matter. Too old at 25. Too old before the real chance had even arrived. For a while, those words followed her everywhere. They sat with her in waiting rooms, in apartments, in lonely evenings when the future seemed to be shrinking instead of opening. By then, she had already worked. She was not some starry-eyed girl with nothing behind her. She had done commercials. She had trained. She had stood in front of cameras enough times to know the difference between a passing fantasy and a profession. But knowing how to work did not mean knowing how to break through. Hollywood was full of people who could do the job. The tragedy was that most of them were never given the moment that changed everything. Nancy Allen came from a world that did not naturally lead to movie stardom. She was born Nancy Ann Allen on June 24, 1950, in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx, the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Eugene Allen, was a New York City police lieutenant, a man whose profession brought with it structure, discipline, and order. Her mother, Florence, noticed something early in her youngest daughter that worried her. Nancy was painfully shy, not merely quiet, but the kind of shy that could stop a child in her tracks, the kind that made ordinary attention feel unbearable. So Florence did something practical. She enrolled her daughter in dance classes when she was only 4 years old. The hope was simple. Movement might unlock what fear kept shut. In some ways, it worked. Dance gave Nancy discipline before it gave her confidence. It taught her timing, posture, control. It placed her in front of people, even when she would rather have disappeared. But it did not magically transform her into a fearless performer. What it did instead was more useful. It gave her a way forward. It taught her that fear did not always have to win. She grew up in a household shaped by routine and expectation, the kind of household where people worked, obeyed schedules, and did not waste opportunities. It was a working-class life with clear edges. You went to school. You behaved properly. You did what was expected. That kind of upbringing does not always produce artists easily, but when it does, it often produces determined ones. As she got older, Nancy wanted something more serious. She wanted training. She wanted to be part of the world she had only glimpsed from the outside. She gained admission to the High School of Performing Arts in Manhattan, the famous institution that had already become a symbol of ambition for young performers. On paper, it should have been perfect. In reality, it was bruising. The atmosphere was harsh, competitive, and relentlessly critical. Instead of drawing something free and exciting out of her, it drained the pleasure from the work. She lasted only about a year. That might have broken somebody else. But leaving that school did not end her ambitions. It redirected them. She enrolled at the School for Young Professionals, where the environment was more forgiving and more practical. There, through classmates and contacts, she found her way into commercial work. By the age of 15, she was appearing in ads and learning a different kind of performance language. Not theatrical, not grand, but precise. Commercials taught her economy. Hit your mark, say the line, find the rhythm of the camera, make something brief feel natural. It was not glamorous work, but it was useful work, and useful work often builds careers more reliably than romantic dreams. She also trained seriously, studying voice and diction, smoothing rough edges, learning how to shape herself into someone directors could use. This mattered. A lot of actors like to retell their early years as a story of chaos and struggle. But Nancy's path had something steadier in it. She worked. She kept working. She learned as she went. Years later, she would sum up that period with blunt simplicity. She did not really think of herself as struggling. She just started working and did not stop. That is a very different kind of ambition, less theatrical, more durable. Still, by the mid-1970s, she felt boxed in. Commercials were paying the bills, but they were not the life she wanted. She was moving through the same narrow lanes, doing competent work, earning money, but not reaching the thing that mattered most. She wanted films. She wanted risk. She wanted a chance to become something larger than a familiar face in short advertising spots. So she made the decision that frightened many young performers and rescued some of them. She went west. Her agents were not enthusiastic. Los Angeles, they warned, was not New York. The commercial market was different. The opportunities were thinner in the areas where she already had experience. Then came the crueler judgment. At 25, she had missed her window. It is one of those remarks that reveals more about the speaker than the person being judged. But in the moment, it must have struck hard. Hollywood has always found ways to make women feel late to their own futures. Nancy went anyway. Before her true breakthrough, she had one small but significant screen appearance in The Last Detail in 1973, playing Jack Nicholson's nervous date. It was only a brief role, just a few days of work, but it left an impression on her. Sets had their own electricity, and this one in particular showed her what film acting could feel like when it was alive. Hal Ashby's environment was loose and instinctive. Nicholson moved in and out of performance so naturally that Nancy barely seemed able to understand when the acting had begun. She later recalled feeling almost frozen with fear, which ironically served the scene well. What looked like good acting was, in part, real nerves. But that experience mattered because it gave her the bug. It showed her the difference between performing and truly inhabiting a moment on film. It made the dream more dangerous, because now she had felt it. She knew what it was like to be near that current. After that, commercials could not fully satisfy her. They were the job. Film was the possibility. And yet, possibility alone did not save her in Los Angeles. By 1975, she was nearly ready to leave. Then came the kind of moment that sounds invented when told afterward, except that Hollywood, absurdly enough, really does run on moments like these. Nancy was sitting in the steam room of a women's health club when she struck up a conversation with another woman. Her name was Harriet Helberg. She was a casting director, and she happened to be working on a horror film adapted from a Stephen King novel. The director was a rising filmmaker from New York named Brian De Palma. That was the opening. Nancy was brought in to read for the role of Chris Hargensen, the beautiful, vicious Queen Bee of Carrie, one of the cruel girls who helped turn a bullied teenager's suffering into catastrophe. It was the final day of auditions. She was the last person to read. There is something almost poetic about that. After months of frustration, after being told she was too old, after hovering at the edge of defeat, she walked into the room as the final chance on the final day, and she did not waste it. What followed was the usual Hollywood madness. Suggestions that she had the role, then signs that the search was continuing, uncertainty, delay, and the emotional instability that so often surrounds casting. But eventually, the answer came. Nancy Allen got the part. That was the hinge. Because Carrie, released in 1976, did not merely do well, it became a phenomenon. Brian De Palma's adaptation of Stephen King's novel arrived as something both shocking and strangely elegant, a horror film charged with adolescent cruelty, repression, humiliation, desire, and revenge. Sissy Spacek's haunted, isolated performance as Carrie White became iconic, but the film needed its predators too. Nancy Allen's Chris Hargensen was not just mean. She was sharp, gleeful, dangerous. She gave the character a cold thrill that made her unforgettable. And for Nancy herself, the role was a liberation of a very strange kind. The shy girl from the Bronx, the child who had once frozen under attention, found herself playing someone vicious, confident, and almost serpentine in her pleasure. That contrast mattered. It revealed something that would define much of her screen presence from then on. She was not interesting because she was simply beautiful. She was interesting because she could place menace behind beauty, intelligence behind coolness, danger behind charm. She could make a character feel watchful. She could suggest that something was always going on beneath the smile. It was one of those performances that does more than launch a career. It names an actor's gift. The film became a commercial success and an artistic breakthrough, and suddenly, Nancy Allen was no longer just another young woman trying to survive auditions. She had crossed over. She had found the door. The agent who had dismissed her at 25 was already wrong, and perhaps that is the first real lesson in Nancy Allen's story. Part 2. The director, the marriage, and the storm of fame. Once Carrie was released, Nancy Allen was no longer standing at the edge of the business. She was inside it. That did not mean life suddenly became easy. Hollywood rarely works that way. A breakthrough can open the door, but it also creates a new problem. Now the question becomes what kind of actress the industry thinks you are. For Nancy, Carrie did more than make her visible. It introduced a particular screen identity: beautiful, sharp, unsettling, and a little dangerous. She was not the soft ingenue. She was not the innocent dream girl. She had something more complicated than that, and more interesting too. There was intelligence in her presence, but also edge. Even when she was smiling, she looked like she might be judging the room. That quality would become her signature. The success of Carrie placed her in the middle of a remarkable period in American filmmaking. The late 1970s were alive with young directors and actors who still seemed to believe cinema could be both art and mainstream entertainment at once. There was money in the business, but there was also experimentation, ego, and ambition. People argued seriously about films at dinner parties. Careers were being built not only in studio offices, but in apartments, screenings, after-hours conversations, and loose circles of collaborators who all seemed to be learning from one another in public. Nancy, who had once been the shy girl trying to find her footing, was suddenly moving among those people. Brian De Palma became central to that world for her, both professionally and personally. Their connection grew during this period, and in many ways it made sense. De Palma, like Nancy, had come out of New York. He had a sharp visual intelligence, a fascination with suspense, sexuality, danger, and performance, and a style that could turn a woman on screen into both subject and spectacle at the same time. Nancy, for her part, had the rare ability to inhabit that kind of material without disappearing inside it. She could be alluring without becoming vague. She could seem vulnerable without losing steel. On screen, she gave De Palma exactly the kind of tension his movies fed on. Off-screen, they became a couple. For Nancy, this was not only a romance, it was also an education. She later spoke about those years with the sense that she had been living inside a kind of unofficial film school. Around De Palma were directors and actors who would define the era. The social world around them included names like Steven Spielberg and Amy Irving, and what Nancy remembered most was not some glamorous parade of stars, but the intensity of the conversations. Young filmmakers talking through scenes, debating old movies, dissecting new ones, speaking with the obsessive seriousness of people who believed film mattered. It was informal, yes, but it was also intellectually alive. She was not just attending parties, she was absorbing a culture. That matters because Nancy Allen's career was never built on celebrity emptiness. She was not simply a face drifting through other people's visions. She was paying attention, watching, learning. The same alertness that had marked her from childhood, that quality of being observant, a little reserved, quietly intelligent, served her well in this new world. She may not always have been the loudest person in the room, but she was taking it in, professionally, the years after Carrie brought steady work. She appeared in I Want to Hold Your Hand in 1978, Robert Zemeckis' first feature. A film with a very different tone from the dark intensity people were beginning to associate with her. It showed that she could move through lighter, more playful material as well. The production itself stayed in her memory for its energy and precision. She remembered being amused the first time she met Zemeckis, mistaking him for a production assistant because he looked so young and unassuming. Then came the surprise. He was the director. That detail is revealing because it captures something true about that era. So many of the people shaping American film then were absurdly young, still rough around the edges, still becoming themselves. The industry had not yet hardened all of them into polished public myths. Then came Spielberg's 1941, a film that would prove far more difficult. On paper, it must have seemed like another exciting step upward. A large production, a major director, a cast full of recognizable names. In reality, it became a drawn-out, chaotic experience. The schedule stretched, the script kept changing. The energy of invention began to blur into exhaustion. Nancy later remembered the production as something unstable, the sort of set where you woke up wondering what exactly you were shooting that day. There were even dangerous moments. During one incident involving flashbulbs, feathers, and fire, she became trapped near a mock-up airplane cockpit and had to be pulled to safety. Her stockings were burned off her legs. It was the kind of moment that reminds you how thin the line can be between illusion and actual danger in movie making. This, too, became part of Nancy Allen's developing screen life. She was repeatedly placed in stories of terror, panic, threat, and survival. And again, she brought to them a realism that did not feel decorative. Even before her most famous roles of the 1980s, she had already begun to collect experiences that would deepen that sense of nerves under pressure. In January 1979, Nancy Allen married Brian De Palma. By then, their lives were fully intertwined. The marriage was the public shape of something that had already become deeply personal and artistic. For an actress, this kind of partnership can be both a gift and a complication. On one hand, she had a director who understood her, who knew how to use her strengths, who could see not just the surface image, but the emotional charge underneath it. On the other hand, being closely identified with one powerful filmmaker can narrow how the industry sees you. Even before any future fallout, that danger was already present in the arrangement. A muse can be admired, but she can also be boxed in. At first, however, the partnership seemed powerful rather than limiting. Nancy's screen presence was maturing, and De Palma's filmmaking was becoming more daring, more provocative, and more controversial. Their collaboration was moving toward the film that would define this period of her life more forcefully than anything since Carrie. That film was Dressed to Kill. Released in 1980, it would become one of the most debated, attacked, admired, and talked about thrillers of the decade. For Nancy Allen, it was the role that transformed her from a recognizable actress into a full-blown screen force. She played Liz Blake, a call girl who becomes entangled in a violent murder mystery after witnessing a brutal killing. It was the kind of role that could easily have been written off as exploitation or reduced to a stereotype in lesser hands. On paper, a role like that could become all attitude and surface. But Nancy brought something more alive to it. Her Liz was streetwise, funny, skeptical, emotionally quick, and unexpectedly grounded. She gave the film human momentum. Surrounded by De Palma's elaborate suspense mechanics, voyeuristic camera movements, and lurid visual style, she remained legible as a person. That is not a small achievement. Often in highly stylized thrillers, the actors become pieces of design. Nancy refused that fate. She made the audience care about the woman inside the spectacle. And yet the film was walking straight into controversy. Even before it fully met the public, Dressed to Kill collided with censorship battles. The Motion Picture Association initially gave it an X rating, which in 1980 was commercially disastrous territory for a mainstream release. Cuts had to be made. Seconds of violence and explicit material became the center of a struggle over whether the film would survive as a major release at all. De Palma publicly fought the ratings board, accusing it of repression and censorship. The film's very existence in the marketplace seemed to depend on small pieces of footage being sacrificed so the whole could pass into theaters. But the battle did not end there. When the movie opened, it became exactly the kind of cultural flashpoint that turns a film into an argument bigger than itself. Some critics praised it. Some admired its bravado, its craftsmanship, its nerve. Others were outraged. Feminist groups protested it. Activists objected to its sexual politics and its treatment of gender and violence. Screenings were picketed. In some places, screens were even attacked with red spray paint. Suddenly, Nancy Allen was not just starring in a thriller. She was standing in the middle of a public fight about sex, danger, morality, censorship, women's bodies, and what cinema was allowed to do. This was a strange place for someone like her to land. The shy child from the Bronx, who had once frozen under attention, was now the woman audiences watched in black lingerie, the woman with a razor at her throat, the woman whose image was being turned into a battleground by strangers projecting all their fears and anger onto the screen. It is easy to talk about controversy in abstract terms, but for actors, it often becomes intensely personal. Their faces carry the argument. Their bodies become symbols in fights they did not invent. Nancy handled it with remarkable steadiness. That steadiness may be one of the most important things about her. She was never a hysterical public figure, never someone who seemed eager to turn every experience into confession. Even when speaking about difficult productions or uncomfortable roles, she usually remained sharp, controlled, and direct. That quality helped her survive material that might have swallowed someone less grounded. She could move through Hollywood's feverish fantasies while still seeming, somehow, like a real person standing just beyond them. And Dressed to Kill did not merely make noise. It also made her a star. Critics who admired the film often singled her out. Even amid all the argument around it, her performance was noticed as something more than provocation. There was humor in it, attitude, and timing. There was also an offbeat intelligence that kept the character from ever becoming disposable. For a brief moment, Nancy Allen occupied an unusual and unstable place in American cinema. She was being celebrated and condemned at the same time, praised for the very performance that others treated as cultural evidence against the film. That kind of moment can be intoxicating, but it can also be exhausting. Because by then, fame for Nancy Allen was no longer a simple matter of success. It came tied to danger, protest, and pressure. She was not merely becoming known, she was becoming controversial. The films that defined her were not safe, respectable vehicles meant to flatter the audience. They were feverish, divisive works that demanded reaction. And Nancy, whether she sought it or not, had become one of the faces of that reaction. The marriage, too, now existed inside that pressure. Working closely with a husband-director can create an intimacy that helps performances. It can also blur everything. Personal trust becomes professional shorthand. emotional familiarity becomes artistic language. Nancy herself later suggested that such closeness could make collaboration both richer and more complicated. When two people know each other deeply, they do not need to explain every choice. But that same closeness can entangle the work with everything else left unsaid. By the beginning of the 1980s, Nancy Allen seemed to have achieved what so many actors spend their lives chasing. She had broken through. She had become associated with major directors. She had a memorable screen identity. She was married to one of the most talked-about filmmakers in America. And she had just starred in a film people could not stop arguing about. From the outside, it looked like triumph, but careers built on edge often move toward even darker territory before they settle. And Nancy's next major film would do exactly that. Because after Dressed to Kill came Blowout, a film colder, sadder, and in some ways more devastating than anything she had done before. It would pair her with John Travolta, bring her to one of the most heartbreaking endings in 1980s American cinema, and show that beneath all her toughness on screen, she could also carry tragedy. That was the next stage of Nancy Allen's transformation, and it would prove that her career was not built on shock alone, but on something much harder to fake: emotional truth. Part 3. The Scream, the Divorce, and the Steal of RoboCop. If Dressed to Kill made Nancy Allen controversial, Blowout proved that controversy was not the limit of what she could do. Released in 1981, the film paired her with John Travolta in what would become one of Brian De Palma's most admired works, though not immediately one of his most successful. On the surface, it was a political thriller, a story of sound, surveillance, murder, and conspiracy. But beneath that machinery was something sadder and more intimate. At its center was a doomed human connection, and Nancy Allen gave that connection its fragile emotional pulse. She played Sally, a woman who is pulled into a nightmare larger than she understands. Unlike Liz in Dressed to Kill, Sally was not sharp-tongued or armored. She did not move through the story with streetwise confidence. She was softer, more exposed, more vulnerable to the machinery closing around her. That shift mattered. By this point, audiences already knew Nancy could play women with edge, wit, and danger. Blowout asked for something different. It asked her to carry innocence without sentimentality, fear without melodrama, and helplessness without passivity. That is much harder than it sounds. A role like Sally can easily become thin on the page, just another woman in trouble, another body endangered for the emotional education of the male lead. But Nancy gave her warmth. She made her feel alive, impulsive, imperfect, human. And because of that, when the story turns cruel, it truly hurts. The film's tragedy depends on the audience believing Sally is not merely a plot device. Nancy makes sure they do. Her chemistry with Travolta became one of the film's quiet strengths. He brought tenderness and urgency to the role of Jack, and Nancy met that energy with something open and unforced. Together, they made the film's center feel emotionally credible, even as the world around them became increasingly stylized and paranoid. This, in truth, was one of Nancy Allen's gifts on screen. She could keep a movie tethered to recognizable human feeling, even when the direction around her was full of cinematic flourishes. And then came the ending. Blowout does not comfort its audience. It does not reward hope. It does not allow love, decency, or skill to rescue the innocent. Its final movements are among the bleakest in American cinema of that period, and Nancy's contribution to that devastation is essential. She plays terror in those last scenes with a force that feels horribly real. There is panic in it, but also something more helpless. The awful truth of being trapped inside another person's design. For viewers, that ending lingers. For Nancy Allen's screen image, it deepened something important. She was no longer just the dangerous woman, the glamorous troublemaker, or the quick-witted survivor. She had shown that she could embody tragedy too. Ironically, the film struggled at the box office when it first appeared. It arrived during the blockbuster era, in a season crowded with larger commercial attractions, and audiences did not embrace it the way later critics would. That is one of the strange recurring patterns in Hollywood. Some films arrive too early for their full reputation. Blowout would eventually be reclaimed as one of De Palma's masterpieces, but in the moment, it did not deliver the kind of commercial victory one might have expected from such a powerful collaboration. Nancy herself later sounded almost bemused that people were still returning to it years afterward. Yet that later recognition matters. It means the performance endured. It means the work survived the marketplace that first misread it. By then, however, Nancy Allen's life was changing in ways the screen could not fully disguise. Working with Brian De Palma had clearly shaped her career. It had also shaped the public understanding of her. She was part of his cinematic world so completely that people often spoke of her as though she were inseparable from his vision. That can be flattering for an actress, but it can also become limiting. When a performer is too closely linked to a director, especially a husband director, the industry sometimes begins to treat her as an extension rather than an artist in her own right. Her successes are interpreted through his authorship. Her persona becomes part of his mythology. It is a subtle form of erasure, because admiration and reduction can exist at the same time. Nancy seemed aware of the complications without publicly dramatizing them. She later spoke about the shorthand that develops when two people know each other deeply and work together repeatedly. That familiarity can make collaboration smoother, more instinctive, more daring. But it can also make the boundaries harder to see. The marriage and the movies were intertwined, and eventually that intertwined life began to come apart. In 1984, Nancy Allen and Brian De Palma divorced. Publicly, she never turned the separation into spectacle. She was not that kind of celebrity, and perhaps that restraint itself says something important about her. In an industry built on confession, gossip, and emotional exhibition, Nancy kept much of her private life private. She did not seem interested in making herself into a tragic heroine for the press. But a divorce of that kind, from a man who had been central not only to her personal life, but to her most defining professional years, cannot have been minor. Even when such endings are civilized, they still break an era in two. And after the break came uncertainty. The mid-1980s were a period of readjustment. There were still roles, but the path was less clear. Some of the material was uneven. Some productions were difficult. Nancy was honest, at times brutally honest, about bad experiences. She could sharply distinguish between a script she admired and a director she felt had failed it. That candor makes her especially interesting in retrospect. She was not one of those performers who floated through every memory speaking in bland, diplomatic cliches. When she loved something, she said so. When she thought a set was badly run, she said that too. That directness gave her interviews a refreshing lack of varnish. She appeared in genre work during these years, including Strange Invaders and The Philadelphia Experiment. The latter brought her a Saturn Award nomination and briefly linked her romantically with co-star Michael Paré. But these films, while important pieces of the journey, did not yet feel like a new defining chapter. Instead, they suggest an actress in transition. Still working, still visible, but moving through a period where the shape of the next era had not fully announced itself. Then came a script she did not even trust at first. When Nancy Allen first encountered RoboCop, she reportedly thought the title sounded ridiculous, maybe even disastrous. It hardly seemed like the obvious vehicle for reinvention. Yet once she began reading, something changed. The screenplay revealed itself as clever, sharp, politically charged, and unexpectedly funny. It was not merely an action picture with a strange name. It was satire, violence, media commentary, and moral bleakness all fused into one. And for Nancy, there was another point of connection too. Police culture was not abstract territory. She had grown up with it. Her father had been a New York City police lieutenant. The world of uniforms, procedure, hierarchy, and loyalty was not foreign to her imagination. When she read the role of Officer Anne Lewis, she felt she knew the ground beneath the character's feet. That recognition gave the performance its foundation. Anne Lewis is, in many ways, the emotional center of RoboCop. Peter Weller's Murphy may be the title character, the man-machine at the center of the film's mythology, but Lewis is the person who keeps the story human. She sees the man inside the armor. She treats him as more than a corporate product or a weapon. In a movie full of grotesque violence, black comedy, and institutional corruption, she becomes one of the few stable moral presences. That kind of role could easily have become thankless. The dependable partner, the supportive woman, the functional side character. Nancy Allen prevented that. She gave Lewis grit without swagger, loyalty without softness, and a calm authority that made her feel completely believable. There was, in fact, a beautiful irony in this transformation. The actress once associated with slashed throats, black lingerie, spiraling terror, and controversial sexuality was now stepping into a police uniform as the sturdy heart of a futuristic action film. Yet the shift did not feel false. It revealed something that had been there all along. Beneath the glamour and danger of her earlier roles, Nancy Allen had always possessed credibility. She had always been able to make toughness feel lived in rather than posed. Paul Verhoeven, directing his first Hollywood feature, seems to have recognized exactly how to use that quality. Nancy later described him as a kind of mad genius, a director of enormous energy who acted out scenes himself, plunged physically into every moment, and then somehow expected actors to find their own way through the chaos he generated. His style could have been exhausting, but for Nancy, it appears to have been exhilarating. RoboCop was one of those productions where the madness became productive. The set had difficulty, yes, but it also had purpose. You can feel that in the finished film. It has the force of something that knows exactly how outrageous it wants to be. Nancy brought personal conviction to the role in small ways too. At one point during production, when a scene suggested that Lewis hand over her gun, she resisted on principle, believing a real police officer would never do such a thing. She even checked with her father, only to discover that in this case her certainty had been wrong. The story is telling. It shows how seriously she approached the part. She was not merely wearing the uniform, she was testing its truth. The physical discomfort of the shoot also became part of the film's lore. In the climactic steel mill sequence, Nancy had to lie in filthy water under freezing conditions. Offered protection beneath the costume, she initially refused because she feared it would alter how she looked on screen. It is a revealing bit of actorly vanity, but also of commitment. In the end, the contaminated water was exactly as miserable as the crew had warned. Yet the take was done, and the reality of that discomfort found its way into the film. Sometimes the body remembers what the camera captures. When RoboCop was released in 1987, it became both a commercial and critical success. It earned more than $53 million domestically on a comparatively modest budget, and quickly established itself as far more than a routine science fiction action picture. Critics and audiences responded to its strange combination of brutality, satire, pathos, and invention. For Nancy Allen, it was something even more valuable, a second major reinvention. She received another Saturn Award nomination, and Officer Lewis became one of the roles for which she would be remembered most enduringly. This mattered because RoboCop proved she had survived the end of one chapter without losing herself in it. Many actors become trapped by the images that first made them famous. Nancy might easily have remained permanently identified with De Palma's erotic thrillers, with dangerous girls, with women framed through menace and scandal. Instead, she moved into an entirely different cinematic register and made that convincing too. She was now part of a franchise, a science fiction icon, a uniformed partner in a dystopian action satire. The shift was dramatic, but because she grounded the role so effectively, it felt earned rather than opportunistic. If Carrie had revealed her edge and blow out her capacity for sadness, RoboCop revealed her steel. She returned for RoboCop 2 in 1990, she training further to make Anne Lewis more physically credible. But the experience was far less happy. Nancy later spoke of the sequel with unusual bitterness, calling it the worst experience of her life and reserving some of her harshest public criticism for director Irvin Kershner, whom she plainly disliked. That level of open contempt was rare for her, which suggests just how unpleasant the production must have felt. Here again, one sees her clarity. She was not interested in pretending that all work is noble simply because it is work. She knew the difference between good collaboration and misery, and she named it. Still, she returned one last time for RoboCop 3, largely out of loyalty, to the character, to the audience, and perhaps to the part of herself that knew Anne Lewis had mattered. Her character was killed off early, a choice later regretted by those involved. By then, the franchise itself had changed, softened, diluted, and in Nancy's view, lost some of its original anarchic spirit. The raw energy of the first film could not easily be recreated under safer, more commercial conditions. That disappointment, too, forms part of the story. Reinvention can save a career, but even successful reinvention does not last forever in the exact form one hopes. By the early 1990s, Nancy Allen had already lived through multiple Hollywood lives. She had been the shy girl from the Bronx, the struggling actress nearly sent home, the cruel queen of Carrie, the controversial heroine of Dressed to Kill, the doomed heart of Blowout, the director's wife, the divorced actress in Transition, the tough, unforgettable officer in RoboCop. That is more than one career, really. It is a chain of transformations. But another transformation was still coming, quieter, less glamorous, and perhaps deeper than all the others. Because the final act of Nancy Allen's life would not be built around film at all. It would come through illness, loss, friendship, and a cause that slowly became larger than Hollywood itself. Part 4. The Quiet Exit and the Life That Mattered More. In 1992, she married comedian Craig Shoemaker. The marriage did not last long. By 1994, it was over. Later, she married contractor Randy Bailey, but unlike many public figures, Nancy never seemed eager to turn her personal life into a spectacle for consumption. There were no elaborate reinventions for the tabloids, no dramatic public monologues, no endless marketing of heartbreak. In another actress, that silence might have seemed strategic. In Nancy, it feels more like character. She had always carried herself as someone who knew where the line was between a public career and a private self. She might use emotion in a performance, but she did not seem interested in living publicly inside it. That reserve became even more striking as the years went on. Through the late 1990s, she continued working, taking supporting roles in films and television without making much noise about them. She appeared in Steven Soderbergh's Out of Sight in 1998, a production she remembered warmly, and she spoke with the same clarity she always brought to directors she respected. She admired filmmakers who knew what they wanted, who could impose shape on chaos, who carried an unmistakable personal stamp into their work. That detail is revealing because it says something about Nancy Allen herself. She was never just looking for attention or exposure. She cared about competence, vision, structure. She responded to people who could build something real out of disorder. She also worked in smaller films and television projects, including Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, which would become her final screen credit in 2003. And then, quietly, she stopped. There was no melodramatic farewell, no one final role, no grand speech about Hollywood losing its soul. She simply stepped away. The departure matched the person. For someone whose career had survived so many storms, there was something fitting in the quietness of that exit. It was not collapse. It was not bitterness. It was a choice. And the reason for that choice is what gives the final part of her life its real weight. The usual story people tell when an actress leaves the screen is one of fading opportunities, disappointment, or exhaustion. Sometimes those stories are true. But Nancy Allen's departure came from something else. It came through friendship, illness, grief, and a growing sense of purpose. A friend of hers, actress Wendy Jo Sperber, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Out of that diagnosis grew a vision for a support center, a place where cancer patients, survivors, and their families could find comfort, guidance, and community in an environment that felt human rather than clinical. Nancy joined the effort as a supporter and helper at first, not yet knowing that this work would eventually transform her own life as deeply as acting once had. The organization became We Spark Cancer Support Center. It opened in 2001 and offered something unusually simple and unusually radical: support that was free. Classes, group programs, emotional care, physical healing practices, and practical help, all in a setting designed to feel more like a home than a hospital. Nancy did not merely lend her name. She worked. She taught yoga in the early days. She helped shape programs. She became involved in the hard, unglamorous labor of sustaining a non-profit in a city where good intentions are constantly threatened by practical realities. This was not celebrity charity at a comfortable distance. This was daily commitment. What is striking here is the continuity beneath the apparent change. On the surface, this looks like a complete reinvention. Actress becomes non-profit leader. But in a deeper sense, the same qualities reappear. Discipline, presence, emotional intelligence, the ability to enter a room and understand what people need, the ability to create a certain atmosphere for others. Even Nancy herself described the work in terms that echoed filmmaking, building an experience, shaping something meaningful, helping another person's story be heard. She once served the imagination of audiences in darkened cinemas. Now she was serving people in bright rooms who were looking for ways to endure fear, loss, and uncertainty. The medium changed. The human work did not. When Wendy Jo Sperber died in 2005, the loss was devastating. But it also clarified Nancy's path. This was no longer a side effort, no longer just a generous project attached to the edges of a film career. This had become the work. In 2010, Nancy Allen was named Executive Director of We Spark, formalizing a commitment that had already shaped nearly a decade of her life. She had not simply found a cause. She had found a second vocation. That may be the most moving part of her story. Because Hollywood so often trains us to value a life according to visibility. We are taught to look at fame as the highest proof of importance, and at leaving fame as some form of diminishment. Nancy Allen's later life quietly resists that logic. She did not vanish into irrelevance. She redirected herself towards something more grounded, more durable, and perhaps more generous. She exchanged the unstable glamour of performance for the difficult, often invisible work of helping people live through one of the most frightening experiences imaginable. That is not retreat. It is evolution. Her personal life during these years seems to have grown even more private, shaped not by tabloid drama, but by ordinary griefs, family losses, the emotional accumulation that comes with time, friendship, our illness, death, and responsibility. The support center became the place where many of these currents converged. In another narrative, this phase would be described as an actress giving back. But that phrase is too small for what happened. Nancy Allen did not merely give back, she reoriented her life. She found a new center of gravity, and yet the actress never entirely disappeared. She continued to surface now and then at film events, retrospectives, and public conversations, where the discussion would inevitably return to Carrie, Dressed to Kill, Blowout, and RoboCop. There is a strange beauty in that. The woman who stepped away was still connected to the women she had once played. The cruel girl with the cold smile, the wisecracking witness in danger, the doomed innocent, the loyal cop who saw the human soul beneath metal. Those performances remained alive in the minds of audiences, even as she herself moved into a life that had little to do with celebrity. Looking back now, Nancy Allen was never quite a conventional leading lady, and that may be one reason she has lasted so well in memory. She did not have the distant porcelain quality of certain classic stars, nor the obvious bombshell persona Hollywood can package so easily. What she had instead was harder to reduce. She felt alert, specific, offbeat. There was intelligence in her face, but not in a self-conscious way. There was beauty, yes, but always complicated by awareness. She could play women at the margins, sex workers, troubled women, dangerous girls, skeptical survivors, police officers navigating male worlds, and make them feel singular rather than generic. In weaker hands, many of those roles would have collapsed into cliché. Nancy Allen gave them texture and credibility. That, perhaps, is her true artistic legacy. Not simply that she appeared in famous films, though she did. Not simply that she worked with major directors, though she certainly did. But that she repeatedly gave shape and dignity to women who might otherwise have existed only as functions of plot. She made them feel as if they had lives before the first frame and private thoughts after the last. That is a rare skill. It is why even now, years after leaving the screen, her best performances still breathe. And then there is the other legacy, the one beyond film. Nancy Allen is alive and well as described in the source script, still associated with WeSpark, and still remembered both for her work on screen and for the work she chose afterward. That double legacy is what makes her story satisfying in a deeper way than many Hollywood biographies. She did not simply survive the industry. She knew when to stop letting it define her. She knew when to refuse, when to endure, and eventually, when to walk away. There is a line attributed to her in the source material. Never count on anything, but be prepared. It feels like the right note on which to end, because it captures something essential not only about her career, but about her life. Chance mattered. So did timing. So did luck, in all its unstable cruelty. But preparation mattered too. Discipline mattered. Character mattered. The frightened child from the Bronx, the actress nearly sent home from Los Angeles, the star at the center of controversy, the woman who later chose service over spectacle, all of them were the same person, simply meeting different chapters of life with different forms of courage. And that may be the clearest way to understand Nancy Allen in the end. She did not build a life by controlling every turn of fate. No one does. She built it by being ready when the turn came. Ready for the role. Ready for the reinvention. Ready for the loss. Ready for the work that mattered more than applause. Hollywood gave her fame. Life asked for something larger. And quietly, without much performance at all, she answered.